everyone. Hope you're doing great. This week we're moving on and talking about race and ethnicity and some of the inequalities around them. So before we jump in, we're going to distinguish between race and ethnicity, and we're going to talk a little bit about the differences between the two. So chances are you probably use the terms race and ethnicity interchangeably, meaning to mean the same thing. But they actually mean really different things. So when we talk about race, oftentimes people ask the question of, what are you? I don't know if you've ever had that asked about your race, where someone just asks, like, what are you? And chances are you had the urge to say human, as I have. But oftentimes what people are meaning when they say, what are you? They're talking about your physical appearance and where you're from. So take, for example, Keanu Reeves. A lot of people have no idea what his ethnic/racial background is. Racially, he kind of looks white, kind of looks mixed, could pass for a Latino. So a lot of people try to figure out what someone is, and what that means is what their racial background is. When sociologists talk about race, they talk about race as a social construct. And what this basically means is how our society has created what race means, how we have determined what someone who's quote unquote white or someone who's quote unquote black or Asian or so on and so forth, what that actually means. Race is actually based on perceived differences in physical appearance. So I don't know if you've ever passed for a different race. Maybe you've passed for Latino when you're actually Asian, or vice versa, or maybe you've passed as African American when you're actually Puerto Rican. So you often have these ideas of what it means to be a member of a certain racial group. And these ideas are really more about perception than physical differences. The other thing we mean when we say that race is about perceived differences or is a social construct is that there are different constructions of categories and all around the world. For starters, what it means to be white has drastically changed throughout history. So if you take a look at this Harper's Weekly journal article cover or journal cover, you can see, and this is from the 1800s, I don't know if you can fully understand what's happening here, but you see black and white on equal scales, and this is this really grotesque, cartoonish image. And what it's supposed to be illustrating is that someone who's of Irish descent and someone who's African American is actually the same. And the reason this was put on the cover is because for quite a long time, Irish Americans were actually seen as people who were black people turned inside out. Irish was not a category that was absorbed into the idea of whiteness in the early 1800s. And it wasn't until the late 1800s, early 1900s, where Irish American people became accepted as part of the white mainstream. The other thing that's really interesting is if you look at different cultures, they have very different ideas of what it means to be of a certain race or not. So if you take a look at the case study of Brazil, they have over 132 racial categories. And I have this great website, I can email it to you if you're interested, of all the different racial categories in Brazil. And they have things like café con leche, or cinnamon, or azul, which is blue. And you're often wondering, like, how can you be blue? But what's really interesting is they base race on skin tone. So someone, presumably who's fair-skinned, who tans over the summer, can go from one race to a different race in Brazil over the course of a season. Now, interestingly, in Japan, they only consider that there's one race that matters, which is the Japanese. And here in the US, when you see someone of Japanese descent and Korean descent or Chinese descent, we assume that they're all Asian or Asian American. But the Japanese actually consider people from Korea a very different racial group than someone who's of Japanese descent. Now, in the United States, we think about race differently than other cultures, obviously. For the most part in the United States, race has been largely defined in terms as black versus white. Even though other groups such as Latinos or Asians have always been in the US, most of the attention in about race relations in the US has been focused on African Americans and white Americans. So if we take a look at the way that we think about race and ethnicity, what's really fascinating is that once upon a time, we actually had very specific racial categories depending on how much you were mixed. So if someone who was African American had a child with someone who was white, they would be half black and half white. The official term that they've designated um, to describe someone of this descent was called, quote unquote, mulatto. Now let's say that person who's half black has a child with someone who's white, they would be a quarter African American, and the term that was used to describe them was quote unquote quadroon, which is now seen as a derogatory term, but back then it wasn't. If you can take a guess, someone who's a quarter black has a child with someone who's white, what part black would they be? If you can kind of see the mathematical pattern here, then you'll notice that they'd be 1/8 black, and the term that they used was octoroon. Now, if that person had a child with someone who's white, they would be 1/16 black, or hexadecaroon. And if that person had a child with someone who's white, they would be 1/32 black, or dotriacontaroon. Now this went up to 1/8,192 part black. And the question is, of course, why was it so important to figure out how much black you had in you? And the reason they had that was what we call the rule of hypodescent, or perhaps you've heard the term the one drop rule. And this is this racist premise that assumes that there's such a thing as quote unquote pure white blood, and that any drop of an inferior race's blood will quote unquote sully the bloodline. And this is why they wanted to figure out how much black someone actually had in them, because the moment you have one drop of black blood, the assumption is that you're ruined as a human. Obviously, we've kind of evolved quite a bit from this time period, but in many ways, we still carry on the legacy of the one drop rule. If you remember Obama, he was seen as the first black president. But the question is, of course, why was he seen as a black president as opposed to a half white, half black president? Because his mother was white. Why was he not seen as a mixed race president? This really shows the enduring legacy of the one drop rule that our society has in place. So again, race is about these perceived biological differences. On the other hand, when we talk about ethnicity, ethnicity is really rooted in culture. So when we talk about culture, we're talking about your ancestral geographic history. Oftentimes, things that determine ethnicity include geography, or where your ancestors originated from. So whether it's Peru or Papua New Guinea or New Zealand, right? This is geography. Where in the world did your ancestors come from? But there's other factors that determine ethnicity, such as language, food, and customs. Um, and obviously, someone whose ethnicity is Mexican is very different than someone whose ethnicity is Cuban, but they also share some of these physical similarities that people determined in the US that make up the Latino American population. What's really fascinating about ethnicity is that we often have a little more freedom with our ethnicity. And Herbert Gans argued that white Americans actually have what he called symbolic ethnicity. And symbolic ethnicity is the freedom to be able to participate in your ethnicity, but your ethnicity doesn't necessarily constrain you in any way. So if you think about Irish Americans on St. Patty's Day can go out and have a green beer, they can eat corned beef and cabbage, they can wear green, and this is all very symbolic. But the very next day, they can be reabsorbed into whiteness. They're not like marked by their ethno-racial identity. If you think about Italians, it's often the same thing. So nowadays, when we see Italian Americans, they're just kind of presumed to be white, but they can kind of freely engage in their ethnic identity whenever they feel like it. Now, if you compare this with someone who's, let's say, Asian American, Asian Americans, because they're racially distinct, they don't necessarily have the same freedom to go from being ethnic to non-ethnic within a 24-hour period. So to recap, race is about perceived physical differences, while ethnicity is about culture. And ethnicity tends to have a little bit more freedom of expression because it's not based on how other people view you, based on your physical differences. So in looking at race relations in the United States, a really helpful tool to conceptualize how sociologists and most social scientists conceptualize group dynamics is by using Lewis Wirth's minority and majority relations. And when we talk about minority and majority, when you're thinking about statistics, we often think about numbers, right? So oftentimes in statistics, anything above 50% is seen as the majority. But when Lewis Wirth was talking about minority and majority, he was talking not just about numbers. He was actually talking about which groups have more power. So the majority or dominant groups typically have a lot more power, prestige, and wealth, while minority groups, on the other hand, have the shared experience of discrimination on the basis of their physical or cultural differences. So if we go back to, remember last chapter, we took a look at ancient Egyptian communities. If you think about this stratification of the pharaoh at the very top and the farmers and the slaves at the very bottom, this really illustrates this minority versus majority relationship, because there's only a very few number of people at the very top, while there's quite a few people at the very bottom. So in this case, the minority group actually makes up more in terms of numbers, but they actually don't have quite a few, don't have nearly as much power or prestige or wealth as the pharaoh or the government officials. So in the US, it's interesting because when we think about minority-majority relations, we can see how this kind of plays out when it comes to racial representation. So take a guess. If you want to grab a notebook and a pen, what percentage of US's population is made up of, let's say, Latinos, African American, whites, Asian, or mixed race? So if you want to just write down what you think the percentages might be, and then we'll see how you fare. And that should say African American, not African America. Bad professor. Give me a break. We're in a pandemic. Just kidding. Anyway, so this is what America actually looks like as of 2017, which is fairly recent. So 60% of our country's population is made up of non-Hispanic white Americans. Hispanic or Latinos make up about 18%, African Americans about 13%, Asians make up about 6%, and then mixed race makes up about 3%. So is this roughly what you thought it would be? The question is, of course, if not, why do you think your perception might have been skewed one way or the other? My guess is that given that we're in California, you probably inflated the number of Latinos, Asians, and African Americans. But remember, the rest of the country does not look like California. The rest of the country is still very much predominantly white. And I don't know if you've ever been to the Midwest or to the South, but the representation of minorities is much smaller in those states than it is in California. But if we go back to this idea of California and think about Lewis Wirth's dominant versus minority relations, even though minorities are actually overrepresented in California, white Americans still have the vast majority of power in California. If you think about political representation, wealth representation, property ownership, whites are still very much in power, even though there are still a lot more minority groups than white Americans. So one thing that you may have noticed is that there is a growing number of racial minorities in the US, and this is a concept that people have called the browning of America. So if you take a look at this chart, and this is also in your book, what this chart does is it breaks down white is the dark blue lines, black is the orange lines, and then other races is the gray line. So as you can see, in 1790, the vast majority of our population was white, about 20% African American, or just under 20%. And this was pretty much the pattern that existed in the US for the most amount of history in the US. But in recent years, what you're seeing is that the number of people who are other races is actually growing. So if you take a look at like 2010, you can see that um, whites are making up about 60% and non-whites make about 40% of America. So when we say the browning of America, what we're saying is that America is looking a lot more diverse nowadays than it ever has in history. So the question is, of course, why? How is it that this has happened? What happened in our political, socio-political landscape that led to the browning of America? So certainly there have been quite a few policies around immigration that have led to the increased population of immigrants in the United States, but I want to just go over a few of them that I think really have shaped the way that our country looks today. So to start, in 1875, we had the Page Act. And the reason why this is a significant policy is because the Page Act was the very first restrictive immigration law in the US. And what this act did is it basically prohibited the entry of Chinese women into the United States. And what it was also called was the Oriental Exclusion Act. The reason this was passed was because there were quite a few Chinese railway workers in San Francisco, and the white Americans lobbied for the restriction of Chinese women because they didn't want the Chinese immigrants to form families. So the theory was that if we don't allow Chinese women to immigrate, then these Chinese men will never have children, they'll never start families, and then they'll die off within one generation. And ironically enough, this actually led to these stereotypes of Chinese women being prostitutes, because the few Chinese women who existed in California prior to 1875, they suddenly found a way to make a living. Some of them became prostitutes, and then this became this huge stereotype. But the reason they became prostitutes is because there was a market for prostitutes, because there were no Chinese women for the Chinese men, and white women were not allowed to cavort with Chinese men, and so there you go. But that was not enough for some policymakers. In addition to excluding Chinese women, 7 years later, they passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. And what this act did is it basically included Chinese men in addition to the Chinese women. So these were the first two restrictive immigration acts that basically stopped an entire country from immigrating into the United States. In 1924, we started to become even more restrictive about immigration in the United States. So the 1924 Johnson-Reed Act said no more immigrants unless you have an existing population here. So basically what this did is it created a quota system of national origin. So let's say the country at the time was 60% German, 30% Italian, 10% Irish. Then the number of immigrants that were allowed to come in were 60% German, 30% Irish, 20% Italian. So the quota system limited who was allowed to come into this country based on who was already here. But the other big contingency in the Johnson-Reed Act was the Asiatic Barred Zone, which basically said no more Asians allowed into this country. And this is pretty much how immigration fared for about 41 years. We closed our doors to immigration for a good amount of time, and it wasn't until 1965 where we passed the Hart-Celler Act. And this lifted the ban of around immigration because the policymakers had hoped to bring in more Western European immigrants. The way that the Hart-Celler Act worked is that there were three stipulations or three ways you could come into this country legally. The first one was through family reunification, and the hope was that the existing white American population would bring over their family members from, let's say, England or Scotland or Italy or Ireland, and bring in more white Americans. However, as you can imagine, since we had stopped immigration for 41 years and immigration was virtually halted, most of the white Americans that were in existence in the United States in 1965 had already assimilated and lost touch with their families back in Europe. So what you saw is that the family reunification clause in the Hart-Celler Act was not really used. What was used, on the other hand, was the skills section of the Hart-Celler Act. And the skills section of the Hart-Celler Act said that if you had the desirable skills that our country needed, and they said things like nursing, engineering, science, medicine, then you could come to this country. And this is the big way that Asian immigrants came to the United States, Latino Americans, and immigrants from the Caribbean immigrated to the United States. And this is the first time you start to see that browning of America. Just as a pro tip, you might want to make flashcards for these policies to help you study for the exam. So when we look at the United States and the diversity of the United States, there are some different ways that different racial groups have relationships. So when we talk about intergroup relations, there are some different ways that people of different racial backgrounds have relationships. And this list basically lists them from the most atrocious to perhaps the most peaceful. So I'm sure you've probably heard the term genocide. And genocide is basically the systematic killing of certain groups of people based on their racial or ethnic backgrounds. We've had quite a few examples in history. I'm sure all of you have heard of Hitler and the Holocaust. But Stalin was actually responsible for the killing of about 50 million people. Pol Pot in the 1970s killed off several million of Cambodians. And it was Pol Pot that actually led to the Cambodian refugee population in the United States. And there's actually a Cambodian ethnic enclave in Long Beach, California. There are some really interesting patterns when it comes to genocides. There are some really, similarities that lead up to genocide. So some of the patterns that sociologists and other social scientists have noticed is that there tends to be extremism in a population where people believe in one extreme versus the other, and they start seeing the other in this like negative, evil light. There tends to be an increased amount of patriotism or nationalism, where you start to see like our country is the best in the world. There is no other country that can compare. The other thing that arises are these us versus them attitudes, where everything's about black or white. There's enemies and there's good people. And then the other big thing that often happens is the leader that is a demagogue that comes into power. And a demagogue is someone who comes into power by playing on the fears of people. So a demagogue will often, find a scapegoat. If you think about the case of Hitler, he found a scapegoat. In his case, it was the Jews. And he said, the Jews are ruining our economy. They own everything. And by playing on the fears of the population, they're able to rise to power and execute their political agenda. That is like the most extreme form of intergroup relations. The next extreme is expulsion. And the expulsion is basically when you take a group and you basically remove them from your population. So in the United States, we have the Indian Removal Act, which I'm sure you've heard of, where It led to the Trail of Tears, where Native Americans were basically forced off of their land and pushed west, killing off about 90% of their population. If you remember the Japanese internment after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, anyone of Japanese descent was basically taken from their homes and forced into internment camps. Many lost their businesses and all of their assets in the process. The other thing that we often don't hear about are Mexican deportations. So for 7 years, the United States practiced Mexican deportations between 1929 and 1936, where anyone with a Mexican surname was basically taken out of their homes, put on a train or a bus, and pushed into Mexico, even if they had no relationship to Mexico. So a lot of the historical archives show that people who are actually third generation Americans, simply because they had the last name of, let's say, like Chavez or Gutierrez, they were pushed back into Mexico and left in a country which they felt no connection to. So that's expulsion, which is basically kicking someone out of your country. The next form of intergroup relation is internal colonialism, and this is the unequal treatment of a specific group in society. So if you think about African Americans in Jim Crow America, shortly after the um, end of slavery, certainly African Americans were quote unquote free, but there were these informal and formal codified laws that said that if your skin is black, you're not allowed to have the same rights as white Americans. So part of Jim Crow laws in the South were literacy laws, where you could not teach someone who is black how to read. Black Americans were not allowed to own land. They weren't allowed to vote without passing literacy tests. They weren't allowed to own horses or dogs in some states. So you definitely saw this very specific unequal treatment of a particular group, which is a form of internal colonialism. Perhaps one of the less negative or painful forms of intergroup relationships is assimilation. And this is where newcomers come into a new country and they basically adopt to a host society's cultural practices, beliefs, and values. Robert Park, the sociologist that came out of the School of Chicago, one of the first sociologists, if you remember from chapter 1, said that if you look at any time an immigrant group comes into a host society, there happens to be this pattern of contact, which is where the hosts of the society and the newcomers make contact with one another. Then there's competition, where they're competing for resources such as jobs, lands, housing. Eventually that leads to accommodation on both sides, and then that's kind of ends in what he calls assimilation, which is when the immigrant group takes on the identity of the American. And if you actually take a look at patterns of immigration, most immigrants and their children assimilate eventually. And this is typically the American pattern, where if you're in America and you are an immigrant in America, the first generation may not speak English well or fully assimilate, but by the second or third generation, you often see full assimilation. The fifth form of intergroup relations is pluralism. And this is actually a very idealistic way to imagine intergroup relations, and it's actually incredibly rare. So this is where all groups in a given territory actually live in peace, and ethnic differences are actually maintained and celebrated. So if you can imagine assimilation as stew, where it's like, okay, so if you think about like beef stew, you put the beef, you put the potatoes, you put the carrots and celery and onion, and by the time you're done cooking, it all kinds of turns into this like big mush, right? And the dominant flavor is beef. So that's assimilation. On the other hand, if you think about pluralism, think about a salad where you have carrots and lettuce and cheese, I don't know what else you put in your salad, tomatoes, and they all maintain their kind of specific different flavor. So if you've ever traveled to Montreal, you would be able to see pluralism there. And when I traveled to Montreal, I was completely shocked because every sign is not just in English, but it's also in French. The vast majority of people in Montreal are bilingual. They speak French and English. you really see this distinct bicultural culture there, and it's really fascinating because it's so different than any society that we are used to in the U.S. So these are the different intergroup relations in the U.S. in any society that you may have seen across historical time periods. So moving on to intergroup relations, I want to talk a little bit. Oh, I forgot. I have a couple images from the Japanese internment. So this is what the internment camp looked like, where a lot of the women were forced into menial labor, like sewing, and they became seamstresses. And then a lot of people who were Japanese entrepreneurs lost their businesses. Um, and as you can see, like many actually put up these signs such as like I am an American. So interestingly, you saw that like heightened nationalism, as you often do in any wartime situation. So now we'll move on to racism in America. And when we talk about racism, we hear this a lot, right? We hear like, oh, that's so racist, or don't be such a racist. Well, what is racism? Racism refers to the attitudes and beliefs where one group is superior or certain groups are superior and other groups are inferior. Historically in the US, we've had really interesting patterns of racism. One of the ways that racism has existed, or one of the faces of racism in America, was what we call scientific racism. And this was this idea that certain groups are scientifically proven to be superior to other groups. And one of the big debates within the scientific racism kind of literature was monogenism versus polygenism. Monogenism was this idea that all people originated from one species. So mono meaning one, genism meaning people. So monogenism is this idea that we all came from like one species. Polygenism, on the other hand, argues that different racial groups come from different species. So similar to, different breeds of dogs, like a Shih Tzu versus a Rottweiler, African Americans and whites and Asians and Latinos all just are different species of perhaps this like larger umbrella category. The other thing that was the other idea under scientific racism that people were concerned about was the degenerative hypothesis, which is that certain groups are degenerative or weakening the genetic pool. They're basically ruining the human species. And this is where we start to see the eugenics movement happen in the United States. So one of the big kind of books that was written in the early 1900s was The Passing of the Great Race by Madison Grant. And here's a picture of his book. And Madison Grant argued that there are certain groups that are superior, and he argued that white Americans were superior to other groups of Americans. And his book was incredibly influential in the eugenics movement. The eugenics movement happened from the early 1900s well into the 1950s. And basically the eugenics movement were a group of people that argued that whites were superior to other groups and that we needed to do everything in our power to basically make sure we weren't diluting the white blood, and we needed to control the population of minority groups in the US. And one of the biggest policies that happened under the eugenics movement was the 1927 Buck versus Bell. So this Supreme Court case passing basically allowed any doctor to sterilize an individual if the doctors deemed that this individual was unfit to be a parent. So if the doctors met you face to face and decided you are not smart enough to be a parent, or you're not physically fit enough to be a parent, or you don't have the morality or the moral upbringing to be a parent, the doctor could sterilize you without you ever knowing. So if you take a look at Carrie Buck, who was the woman that, led to this court case being passed, was young girl. She was 17 years old, and then she went to the hospital to, I believe, have her tonsils removed, and then when she came out, she was sterilized, had no idea for the vast majority of her life. And this was the case for 70,000 forced sterilizations in the United States. So many people went on their entire lives not realizing why they couldn't have children, only to realize after a full comprehensive physical that they were sterilized at some point in their life. So this eugenics movement was often propagated through propaganda such as this. So this was a poster during the eugenics movement, and as you can see in the image, it says some people are born to be a burden on the rest. And this is actually in the museum that shows a lot of eugenics propaganda. And essentially what's really interesting that a lot of people forget conveniently is that Madison Grant's book actually inspired the Nuremberg laws, which led to the Holocaust. We often think about the Holocaust in this like terrible way in the United States. We think like they were the bad guys, we were the good guys. Well, the Nuremberg laws, which led to the Holocaust, were inspired by eugenics laws and American authors promoting these ideologies in the United States. So when we talk about racism, we often hear the terms prejudice and discrimination, and a lot of people use these terms interchangeably. But there are some distinct differences. When we talk about prejudice, we are often talking about prejudging. So prejudice often means the thoughts that we have about certain groups. Discrimination, on the other hand, refers to the practices and actions based on prejudiced thoughts. So if you think about individual acts of discrimination. Maybe perhaps you know someone who doesn't want to sit by someone who's African American or sit by someone who's Asian American. That is an individual act of discrimination. Discrimination can also be systemic. So if you take a look at the redlining that happened in the US historically when it came to residential segregation, that was systemic discrimination targeting certain groups to not allow them to live in certain neighborhoods. Now the question is, of course, can you be one but not the other? So think about this. Do you know anyone who is prejudiced but doesn't act on their prejudiced beliefs? Or do you know someone who's discriminatory but isn't necessarily prejudiced? So Robert Merton came up with this chart, and he said, absolutely. So there are different ways that prejudiced versus prejudicial acts or thoughts and discriminative acts work out. So in the far left quadrant, you see people who are prejudiced and discriminating. These are what he called active bigots. So this is someone who might be a member of the KKK, who also goes out and does cross burnings on the lawns of African Americans. Now, if you take a look across, you see someone who may not be prejudiced, but may be discriminating. So this is someone who is not prejudiced, but does discriminate. These are what we call the fair weather liberals. So the question is, of course, why would you discriminate if you're not prejudiced? If you can imagine, the US in the 1950s when we had segregation, not everyone believed in segregative practices, yet many people just went along with it because it was easier to go along with it than speak out against it. So these are people that may not believe in the inferiority or superiority of certain groups, but they just kind of go with the flow because it's easier for them. Or people who live in segregated neighborhoods who don't have prejudiced thoughts. Most people, I would argue, fall into the category of timid bigots. These are people who may be prejudiced but don't necessarily act on their prejudiced beliefs. So you may have like a grandparent who believes that certain groups are inferior, but they don't go out and lynch on the weekends, right? So timid bigots tend to be fairly frequent because it's easy to believe things. It's much harder to act on those beliefs. And then on the very last quadrant, we have what Robert Merton called all-weather liberals. So these are people who are not prejudiced and make very specific attempts not to discriminate. So we talk a lot about racism nowadays. So when it comes to contemporary discussions of race, there are quite a few terms that get thrown around frequently. One of the popular terms that came into the American lexicon in the late 1900s is what we call colorblind racism. Many of you are probably too young for this reference, but back in the day, there used to be this radio station called 92.3 The Beat. And one of my favorite DJs on this radio station was this Japanese American DJ named Theo. And he always talked about, increase the peace, reduce the violence, we're all the same, there's no such thing as race. And this is what we call colorblind racism. So this is this assertion that race has no bearing on one's life chances and that racism doesn't exist. There's this idea that race is this, and it's interesting because people who are colorblind racists actually take on the argument that race is socially constructed and therefore there's no such thing as race, but they take it a step further, right? They say there's no such thing as race because it's socially constructed, and therefore race doesn't exist and racism doesn't exist. And there are quite a few ways that colorblind racism kind of perpetuates racism. One of the ways that it does is this idea of abstract liberalism. And abstract liberalism is this idea that everyone can just try hard and succeed. So there's this idea of like intense meritocracy. If someone who is African American or Latino is not succeeding, it's because they're not trying hard enough. This is this idea under abstract liberalism. It completely ignores the fact that there are structural impediments that lead to certain groups, not being able to succeed as much as other groups. Naturalization refers to this idea of our um, national identity playing a big role in our kind of ability to succeed or not succeed. And then there's cultural racism, which is that this argument that certain cultures tend to do better than others. And if you think about like the model minority myth, right, this idea that Asian Americans are the model minority, this is cultural racism, because what they do is what colorblind racists do is they say, look at this group, they're able to succeed, and therefore the other group down the street are not succeeding because they're not trying as hard as the first group. And it's because they don't have the cultural values. So instead of talking about race in terms of like skin color and structural impediments, they're talking about cultural factors. So a lot of times when you hear cultural racism in place, they say, well, Asian Americans are successful because they try really hard and they take on the right cultural values, and other groups don't succeed because they don't have the right cultural values. And perhaps the most deleterious problem with colorblind racism is the minimization of racism. And minimizing something is basically saying it's not as big of a problem as it is. So people who minimize racism often say like, oh, you have to always make this about race, or slavery has been ended for 200 years, why do you still want to talk about it, etc., etc. So basically saying racism is not a problem. Another big concept that's been thrown around, and perhaps you've heard this term, is white privilege. And this is a very controversial term that people tend to get very heated about. White privilege is a term coined by Peggy McIntosh back in the 80s. And in the 1980s, she wrote this powerful essay that really led people to think about race in very distinct ways. And what she argued is that white Americans are born with privilege that other groups are not, simply because they're not born with the baggage that comes with being African American or Asian American or Latino American or Middle Eastern or any other non-white group. White privilege is simply the freedom of not having to deal with systemic racism. A lot of people get confused with the term white privilege. They think that white privilege means that you didn't work hard for what you have, and she wasn't arguing that at all. She was basically saying that if you're white and you're American, you don't have to deal with racism in the same way that other groups do, and this gives you an advantage. And she had a list of 50 things, 50 examples of white privilege. So one of the big examples that often stands out for students is the Band-Aid example. And so she argued, if you think about the color of Band-Aids, they often make Band-Aids the color, the skin tone of whites. If you are a dark-skinned African American, the Band-Aid is very, kind of like a stark contrast to your skin color. If you go to the makeup counter and you look at like the different tones of porcelain, right? So the different like shades of whiteness there are, and compare that to the shades of non-whiteness, there's a very distinct advantage there. Another great example she gives is if you ask to talk to the manager of any retail place, you're often going to be encountered with someone who's white and typically male. So all of these are ways that our society operates in such a way where whites don't have that systematic oppression that other groups do. There's another great term that's been tossed around in recent years called microaggressions, and microaggressions are basically subtle forms of racism that it's often even questioned as to whether or not this is racist. So one microaggression that I hear a lot is, well, you speak English really well. And I often respond with, well, why wouldn't I? I was born in Brooklyn. Um, and you hear African Americans encounter this too, like you speak so eloquently. When President Barack Obama came into office, people said like, wow, he speaks so eloquently. Well, what did you expect him to speak like? He went to an Ivy League college and is extremely educated. So the assumption there is that someone who's Asian may not be able to speak well, or someone who's African American may not be able to speak well. And even though it's not this like overt racist term where you're using this derogatory term to describe someone, there is this very subtle racist kind of undertone there. So I'm sure many of you may have experienced a microaggression at some point. There's actually a great website where people are like recording the microaggressions that they've experienced, so just so there's a record of them out there. So if you're interested, I could send that to you. Just shoot me an email. Well, those are really interesting forms of racism. Sociologists are far more interested in what we call institutionalized racism. And what institutionalized racism refers to is basically when our social institutions, such as the government, our neighborhoods, our criminal justice systems, are organized to systematically discriminate against certain groups. So this is where racism is woven into the pattern of society. A really great example of institutionalized racism is residential segregation. And residential segregation didn't just happen by accident. So if you're familiar with Los Angeles, for example, you probably noticed that Los Angeles proper as the city is incredibly segregated by race. So if you think about like Boyle Heights, this is a very heavily Latino area. If you go to the west side, that's very Persian, very white. If you go to South Central, that's very African American. And the question is, of course, how did that happen? It didn't happen by accident. We actually had several practices, things like redlining and blockbusting, and restrictive covenants that led to the residential segregation of certain cities, Los Angeles included. And basically, this was in place from the early 1900s well into the 1970s until the Federal Housing Authority deemed it illegal. And restrictive covenants, for example, basically said if you bought a home in a certain planned community, you signed a covenant that said you would not sell that home to a certain racial group, typically African American, Asian American, Latino American. And that's how a lot of white communities in the early 1900s, 1950s, and 1960s maintained their whiteness. Redlining basically was a practice that banks engaged in, where they would take a map and they would literally take a red marker and mark the neighborhoods that were heavily minority, so Latino neighborhoods and African American neighborhoods, and they would basically devalue those neighborhoods, making it harder for the homeowners in these neighborhoods to move out because their homes would be devalued, they wouldn't be able to gain equity, they wouldn't be able to sell for a profit, and they wouldn't be able to leave that neighborhood. So essentially, a lot of the residential segregation we see today in contemporary society is a byproduct of, about a century of discriminatory practices towards certain groups. And a lot of sociologists have been interested in studying residential segregation, and one measure that they use to measure residential segregation is what they call the index of dissimilarity. And what the index of dissimilarity is it's a score from 1 to 100. And a score of 1 basically means that there's almost no, actually it's 0, so 0 to 100. 0 means there is complete equality. So if a neighborhood is, 60% white, 13% African American, 18% Latino, and 6% Asian American, that is a completely integrated neighborhood because it represents the larger population. A score of 100 means that there's, extreme segregation, meaning that there's just like, the vast kind of separateness of groups living far apart from one another. And if you take a look at some of the top metropolitan areas in the US, like New York City, there's actually a huge degree of segregation. And it's funny because you think New York City, oftentimes you think immediately diversity, right? It's like the melting pot of America. But there is incredible residential segregation in New York. If you ever have been to New York City and you've taken the train from one end of the island to the other, you see a very distinct difference in the people that get on the train and get off, depending on where on the island you are. So New York has one of the highest dissimilarity index scores of 84.3. Chicago is also incredibly segregated at 83.6. Philadelphia, another part of the country we often think as extremely diverse, pretty high index of dissimilarity score. And Los Angeles is pretty still segregated, as you can see, as their score is 70.5. So this is just one example of institutionalized racism. And as you can imagine, many of our other institutions in the United States are, racist in many ways. Even our churches, which is supposed to be this open, loving place, are often kind of segregated based on one's racial background. So that concludes this lecture. Hopefully it was interesting and you learned a lot, and I'll see you in the class.